For Spence.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise here today to speak in favour of the Treasury Laws Amendment making multinationals pay their fair share, Integrity and Transparency Bill 2023. Beyond the introduction of this bill to the House, I am also glad to see that it was the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury that was responsible for doing so. I know, and for that matter, anyone that knows him well or even has a vague knowledge about him would know that the Assistant Minister is extremely passionate about this issue and is determined to see some real progress occur in this space. Which is not to say that many of us on this side of the chamber don't share that same position. We definitely do, though the Assistant Minister's passion in areas such as this makes him quite an advocate for the devil in the detail. Seeing real action on corporate tax avoidance, and in particular by large multinationals, has been a long time coming. The world is a vastly different place than it was in 1915, when Australia first introduced company tax, something that helped us to fund the financial burden we faced as a result of World War I. Back then, international travel both to and from Australia was done by boat, with journeys taking weeks out at sea. But today, corporate profits can now travel out of Australia to countries as far off as Bermuda, the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands in the time it takes for signatures to appear on a number of documents in a lawyer's office. And I think there was a time when we thought the Concorde was lightning fast. I know there is a great deal of enthusiasm to multinationals pay their fair share of tax by members on the crossbench, and I'm sure there are some in opposition that want to see progress in this space too, though I'm sure their support is somewhat less enthusiastic compared to other parts of the chamber. I would have thought they would be cheering from the sidelines on this one, because after all, it is an established fact that the Liberal and National parties have had the two highest taxing governments of the past 30 years. Perhaps it's the source of those taxes that matter the most to those opposite. And on that note, we couldn't agree with them more. We want to see more multinationals paying their fair share of tax in Australia, after all. And just think, with the extra revenue generated by measures in this bill, those opposite could have built some eye-wateringly large car parks in Liberal and targeted marginal seats with all that extra money. They just lacked ambition. Speaker, we are ambitious for it. Those opposite stand on the shoulders of giants, after all, giants such as Joe Hockey, a former Treasurer who spoke of Australia being a nation of lifters and leaners within our economy. When multinationals that generate billions in annual revenues in Australia somehow end up paying zero or next to zero tax, you can only conclude that they are leaning on Australia. Leaning on hard-working Australians who pay their taxes with a few deductions here and there, but they essentially contribute more income tax than a company that has taken in billions that year in revenue that was earned right here. Australia is meant to be the nation of the fair go, and that is most definitely not the best example of this being the case. I am at least somewhat hopeful that the present-day member for North Sydney sees things differently than her predecessors. Speaker, given some of the global events that have transpired over the past few years especially, very few things truly startle us. But there is a distinction between shocked and surprised. For example, when I heard that in the 2021 financial year, Chevron paid $30 in income tax in Australia, $30, on the back of revenue to the tune of $9.1 billion and a taxable income of $113 million. Am I shocked? You bet I am. Am I surprised? Absolutely not. I am by no means approaching this from a background in corporate law or as a tax practitioner, but on the numbers alone, we can all share in the perspective that something is clearly not right. There are many examples of companies operating in Australia that have paid very little income tax in Australia on the back of substantial revenue made in Australia. The list is a long one. Some have paid zero or effectively zero for several years now. Thankfully, that data is now published through the Australian Taxation Office, through taxation transparency measures. And if you want to uncover the names of some of the worst offenders, I'd encourage you to Google it, because they've definitely been one of them. The brazen nature of corporate tax minimisation and avoidance is quite staggering, frankly. The effects can be felt by all of us. With the $30 paid by Chevron in tax in the 2021 financial year, instead of being able to contribute to paying for doctors or nurses at our hospitals or going toward vital public infrastructure, We can instead award one lucky taxpayer a few family-sized pizzas and maybe even a garlic bread with Chevron's generous contribution instead. A significantly more modest meal compared to a double Irish with a Dutch sandwich that many global corporate behemoths have chowed down on from time to time. Some may say that some suspected companies haven't utilised that, or similar methods, or that they don't utilise strategies like that anymore. Maybe it was a sometimes food, or maybe tax transparency laws across the globe have shamed them into ceasing the practice. Outside of the minds of the most hardcore free marketeers and libertarians among us, some of those practices utilised by many giant multinationals shock the conscience to those with the ability to understand what they entail. But in the broader sense, multinational enterprises hoodwinking our tax system and taxpayers in general to the fact that they could pay more tax but will spend millions on lawyers and accountants to avoid paying millions and billions in tax is something the Australian people do not want to see continue with such flagrant disregard for our country. In fact, the passage of this bill through the House is yet another example of the Albanese Labor government following through on an election commitment. Who knew that big multinational companies paying an equitable level of tax, or at least more than they'd had to in a given financial year, would be a vote winner? But of course, the problem of complicated tax strategies for large multinational enterprises is not something that is a uniquely Australian problem. It is a problem faced by many countries in the developed world, and particularly within the OECD. The OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been investigating corporate tax avoidance for several years now, and given that its member nations comprise of over 60% of the world's GDP and 3/4 of global trade. A cooperative approach by member nations on a domestic level can go a long way to curbing the ability of multinational companies to employ many commonly utilised strategies of corporate tax minimisation and tax avoidance that exists today. But returning to this bill, the bill is split into two schedules which neatly bifurcate the means employed to achieve the outcome of getting multinational enterprises to pay their fair share of tax in Australia. Broadly speaking, Schedule 1 is focused on the disclosure of subsidiary entities, which Schedule 2 geared toward amending Australia's thin capitalisation rules. It is my hope to get stuck into explaining the nature of each schedule and why these reforms are sorely needed in Australia and, for that matter, abroad. Although, given the complex and voluminous subject matter, this may become a difficult task within the time constraints imposed on us. Better get a move on. So, Schedule 1. Schedule 1 lays the groundwork to impose greater financial reporting obligations for Australian public companies, whether they are listed or unlisted, to affirmatively disclose relevant corporate entities in their annual financial reports and, if passed, would require this to commence from this current financial year. This is the first step to addressing the problem. It should not take the release of another Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, Paradise Papers, or a leak from the inside to let governments, both our own and that of other nations, taxpayers and investors to get insight of a multinational's corporate structure. Tax transparency is important. It shouldn't take leaks from insiders or corporate whistleblowers to uncover the full story behind how much tax a company pays and the layers upon layers of related corporate entities it has around it in order to shift profits, debt, IP or other intangibles around in order to avoid paying tax in one or multiple jurisdictions, or to muddy the waters to make investigating their tax affairs manifestly difficult to downright impossible for the most trying to decipher the labyrinthine maze of financial documents that are publicly disclosed. Something that will provide a great deal of guidance to many about the true nature of how assets, revenue and liabilities move around between branches, essentially grow from the same trunk. Having information like this being the norm can give the public better insights as to how good a corporate citizen and enterprise is within their country. This is useful for governments, useful for investors, institutional, all the way down to individuals who aren't particularly sophisticated themselves. Every type of investor across the spectrum has a right to make their decision-making on ethical choices a company makes such as this. and it is also a viable tool for the consumer when there is enough viable market competition for them to make a valid judgment call on whether to shop with a competitor instead of a corporation that specifically goes out of its way to avoid paying tax in Australia, especially one that has made a concerted effort to do so financial year after financial year. It isn't fair to Australian companies that do the right thing, especially when they try to compete with global giants that duck and weave paying tax in Australia. Having a more digestible means of being able to follow the money is the right thing to do, no matter who is attempting to read this level of detail about a company. Its subsidiary companies, trusts that a company may be the trustee of. The schedule accomplishes these aims through amendments to the Corporations Act 2. As I had alluded to earlier, create requirements for the disclosure of information by Australian public companies concerning subsidiaries in the form of a statement that is disclosed in a manner similar to others at the end of the financial year. This statement would include the names of relevant entities, the type of entity, meaning whether it's a body corporate, partnership or a trust, their tax residency status and, in the case of a body corporate, the percentage of ownership by the company releasing this statement. Schedule 2 of the bill, on the other hand, concerns thin capitalisation, which, in an ordinary sense, capitalisation refers to the levels of debt to equity or gearing of a business. However, thin capitalisation and how Schedule 2 of the bill affects the practice of a highly leveraged business utilises this too. In large part, minimise their profits by way of debt, which is owed to often closely associated corporate entities to the business through interest payments on the debt that's parked on their balance sheet. The multitude of amendments further bolster the current rules that are in place within Division 820 of the Income Tax Assessment Act, which, if they were working as desired, we would not be here right now. It is common practice amongst jurisdictions across the globe, but Australia, along with many others, are moving to place limitations on this practice. The bill's explanatory memorandum approximates that 2,500 taxpayers have potential to fall under the scope of the changes set out in Schedule 2. Quite notably, the changes alter the approach for calculating the permissible limits from being a 1.5 to 1 debt-to-equity ratio, instead cap interest deductions in a given financial year to 30% of EBITDA, meaning the earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation. The rule changes do allow for a degree of flexibility and choice for entities given the ultimate goal is to deter and prevent cynical arrangements that appear to have little commercial justification other than tax minimisation. The process, largely aided by consultations on this legislation, aims to reduce the potential for unintended consequences that may occur if the applicable rules were rigid and agnostic to the type of commercial activities a business is involved in, as an example, which is evidenced by the exclusion of related party debt from consideration, which was aimed particularly at not adversely affecting the legitimate incurring of debt which aids to property and infrastructure investment. I would actively encourage all members to pick up a copy of the explanatory memorandum for a more thorough explanation of the voluminous provisions contained not just in Schedule 2 but across the bill in its entirety. On a concluding note, I had observed the contribution made by the member for Hume in this place yesterday evening, the shadowy treasurer. The member for Hume came into this place parroting tired old lines that are quite easily refuted. You can always count on the member for Hume to supply his own hot take on economics or financial reports. He talks about productivity falling by 4.6%. He did so again reflexively during the debate on this bill last night, yet he continues to ignore that the weakest quarter was almost solely presided over by the Morrison government. You either call him naive for not knowing these things, or worse, if he was aware of this inconvenient truth, I'll let us all reflect silently on which side of the coin the truth might land on. If he doesn't like where an argument is going, he'll find some statistics to misdirect the room like someone playing economic three-card Monty at a street corner. If he doesn't like the numbers, he will thump his chest and argue louder as if to shield the audience from hearing the words he is using. If the argument isn't on his side and the numbers aren't on his side, as the City of Sydney is all too aware, there's always PDF editor. One can always count on the member for Hume to make you wonder what he can count on, what his party room can count on him for, and lastly, whether he can count at all.